Welcome and good evening. My name is Bill Picara. I'm a librarian at the Northbrook Public Library, and on behalf of our partners at Glenview and Arlington Heights Libraries, I would like to welcome you to tonight's program, 33 and a Third from Elvis in Memphis. Tonight is the 8th program of our year-long monthly series of 12 different albums featuring each 33 and a Third book's author talking about that essential album. If you didn't know before tonight, 33 and a Third is a series of short books about popular music, each book featuring an iconic album that occupies a specific place in music history. Our series will continue through May of 2022, and we will continue to take advantage of the virtual space provided by Zoom. This allows us to feature authors from all across the country. Up next, in February, on the 15th, is Annie Zaleski, Rio. With that, I'm very excited to introduce tonight's author, Eric Wolfson. Eric has worked as an artist and a musician in Boston and New York. He currently works at the United States Copyright Office in the Library of Congress. So with that, Eric, I'll let you take it over.
All right. Thanks, Bill. I appreciate it. All right. So my name's Eric Wolfson. Thank you so much for having me here. This is a really cool program you guys are doing, and I was very flattered to be invited to do it, and psyched to go. So just to give a little bit of my background with the 33 and a Third series, I actually looked it up and found out that tomorrow, January 14th, is actually the 14th anniversary of the year that I originally, to the day that I emailed David Barker, who used to be the editor when these were published on Continuum, and just cold pitched him Jerry Lee Lewis's Live at the Star Club Hamburg. They weren't taking proposals then, and it didn't work out, but he was very nice and emailed me back. And basically, for the next 11 years, I submitted proposals every time they had an open call, which was about every other year. And I just, after the Jerry Lee thing didn't work out, I kind of got cocky in my head and was like, well, you know, somebody's going to end up doing Elvis, so may as well be me if they like what I do. So I then just did nothing but pitch Elvis albums for a decade. I first did I pitched the Sun Sessions and didn't get it. And I did the Elvis's first album, just the classic Elvis Presley. They then switched their editors, and I pitched that again to no avail. I then did the $1 Million Quartet CD with Jerry Lee Lewis and Carl Perkins and maybe Johnny Cash, and that didn't go either. So after all that, after 4 Elvis pitches, I was like, all right, I'm gonna have to switch gears. And so I was all ready to do the Sesame Street sing-along record when I contacted all the living people that were part of this, and basically none of them got back to me except for the voice of Prairie Dawn. So I was sort of stuck again. And so I was like, well, maybe I'll give Elvis one last shot. And thank God I did, because I chose From Elvis in Memphis, which I think is a studio masterpiece and tells the best story of out of all of his albums, in my opinion. So let's get to it. I'd like to first point out today that today is January 13th, which is the 53rd anniversary of Elvis starting his sessions at American Sound. He walked in on this very day, 53 years ago in 1959, and started recording with the first song, Long Black Limousine was the first one they recorded. We're going to talk about that and more stuff in a little bit, but just wanted to say it's a pretty cool day to be doing this, and I'm psyched to be here. The other thing I wanted to mention too is just I studied history, and I work a lot with historical documents, and I just one thing that's really hits me about this project and all history projects is that it sounds obvious to say, but you know, we know how everything is going to turn out, and the people participating don't. And that's sort of obvious, but then it's also like, you know, we know that Elvis will ultimately become this, you know, icon to this day, but, you know, he didn't necessarily know that, and the people in his time didn't necessarily know that. So what I love about this album and this period of his life is that it really sort of tells his story where he's sort of going through a renaissance and kind of reclaiming himself artistically. So how do we get there? I'm going to do just some quick background on Elvis before we get too deep into the record. So let's see what we got. All right. So Elvis Aaron Presley was born January 8th, 1935 in Tupelo, Mississippi to Vernon and Gladys Presley. They had a really hard life as part of a poor white family during the Great Depression. They were basically, for whites, they were the lowest rung of the social ladder. They really, they were very, Vernon built the house that Elvis was born in. They didn't have grass in their front yard. It was a dirt yard. They didn't have plumbing. They had an outhouse. It was really pretty bleak. And Elvis famous later said, "We were broke, and we left Tupelo overnight. Dad packed up all our belongings in boxes on top of a 39 Plymouth. It was actually a different model, but regardless, we just headed for Memphis. Things had to be better." So they moved around in Memphis. Elvis was 13 when they moved to Memphis, and they moved around from place to place until they got a 2-bedroom apartment in the Lauderdale Courts housing project, which really sort of became their first community where there were other families like them, and they were able to find something similar to what they had in Tupelo in terms of a community that understood their religion and background. Elvis was the first in his family to graduate high school and became a driver for Crown Electric. One quote that I really like of Elvis's that sort of stuck out with me as I wrote this book was he said, "I guess if you were poor, you always have to think bigger and want more than those who have everything when they are born. We didn't. So our dreams and ambitions could be that much greater because we had so much farther to go up than anybody else." So there's this idea that, in Elvis's life, he knew poverty basically just as long, if not longer, than he knew success. So while we think of him as this very rich, successful guy, in his own, from his perspective, he spent so much of his life being poor and humble and, from this very sort of low background that, it's not the fact that he's able to become as famous as he does, it's just, one wonders if he, had to just, like he says, like dream sort of that much bigger in a way, just to kind of be able to get across to that kind of an audience. So in 1953, Elvis graduates from high school, drives the truck. He drives past Sun Records all the time. He finally gets up the nerve to make a couple vanity records. Sun Records was founded about 3 years earlier by Sam Phillips, who was also the producer and worked the controls and made the records. And he set it up to get African-American rhythm and blues music out there. It was literally the only recording studio in all of Memphis. So pretty much every great Memphis bluesman, and there were a lot of them like B.B. King and Rufus Thomas and Ike Turner, all recorded some of their very first records there. So Elvis sort of keeps popping back, and then, he comes in, he's singing ballads, and then Sam Phillips gets a Ballad Without You, a demo for it. And they get, he's like, maybe Elvis could come in and try it. Elvis comes in, it completely sucks. Elvis can't do it justice. He goes kind of crazy. And Sam Phillips is intrigued, has him run through a bunch of stuff, basically sends him home with these other guys, Scotty Moore on lead guitar and Bill Black on bass. And then he practices with them and tries to get some stuff together. They come back, they do more ballads that are kind of meh. And then on a coffee break or soda break, they break into this. So that's, of course, That's All Right. That's his first record. It was a huge hit in the South. He followed it up with Good Rockin' Tonight, Baby Let's Play House, Mystery Train. He spends 1955 touring, playing shows, several shows a day, almost every single day. And then in the summer, he meets up with Colonel Tom Parker, who becomes his manager and, makes a deal with RCA Records for $35,000, which was an unheard of amount for a country singer unknown outside of the South. So that sets up Elvis for 1956. He then breaks through. He becomes humongous, arguably bigger than any other rock star in their day because there was just so little else to compete with. Elvis first had Heartbreak Hotel. It came out in January, went to #1 in May. He followed it up with I Want You, I Need You, I Love You, Hound Dog, Don't Be Cruel, Love Me Tender. All these were #1 hits on the Billboard bestsellers charts. And he ended up spending 25 weeks, almost half the year, with the #1 record, which is kind of crazy if you stop and think about it. He also had 14 weeks with the #1 hit album between his first album, Elvis Presley, and his second album, Elvis. And when he debuted on the Ed Sullivan Show, 60 million people watched, which was 82% of the viewing audience, which again was a record at that time. He also got his first film contract, made his first film, Love Me Tender. So 56, Elvis is basically on top of the world. We fast forward 10 years, 1966. Elvis has gone into the Army in 1958. He comes back and increasingly does more movies with diminishing returns. They all essentially make money, but their quality isn't that great. And so by 66, which is, right smack in the middle of when the Beatles are releasing Revolver, Bob Dylan's doing Blonde on Blonde, and the Beach Boys are doing Pet Sounds. Elvis is doing this. So that was recorded in one take. He stormed out without completing it, and they still used it in the movie and on the soundtrack. He was told that it would not appear on the soundtrack, which was the only reason why he recorded in the first place. It then appeared on the soundtrack anyway, and he was livid. In his wife, Priscilla's autobiography, she talks about how he was, freaked out about it and was like, it's a joke and I'm the joke. And it was really the epitome of him getting sort of cornered into these movies that, weren't up to his par of what he was capable of, and doing these kind of throwaway soundtracks. And so Old MacDonald did come out on the Double Trouble soundtrack on June 1st, 1967. And then the following day in America, the Beatles released Sgt. Pepper. So for me, that's kind of the ultimate juxtaposition of Elvis basically being lost before he came back. So how did he come back? In 1968, the Colonel, his manager, booked a TV special for him, with the idea being that it could be a Christmas special, Elvis in tux and tails, and singing Christmas songs for the family. For a rare time in Elvis's career, he defied the Colonel and decided that he was going to do a rock and roll extravaganza. He got a kindred spirit in Steve Binder, who was the young guy on the left in this picture here, who directed the special. And there's this kind of crazy moment where Elvis is looking out the window, and Binder asks him what he thinks would happen if Elvis went and walked down the street on Sunset Boulevard where they were filming. And Elvis said, "I don't know. What do you think will happen?" And Binder said, "Nothing. I don't think anything's going to happen." So a couple days later, Elvis was like, we're gonna test this out. So he grabbed Binder. He didn't want anyone else from his entourage that was always with him. He just wanted Binder. And they basically walked down the street in Sunset Boulevard, and nothing happened. And people just walked by. People just bumped into them and kept going. Cars were driving by. No one was slowing down. No one was stopping. And Binder was like, I really think that the Colonel had kept feeding Elvis that, you're so huge, you can't walk outside. That Elvis just assumed that was true, 10 years later. And, Elvis starts waving to people in the cars going by, still nothing. Binder later claimed that he's like, since they were in California and everything's fake, he thought that if people knew that was actually Elvis, it would have started a scene. But regardless, I'm skeptical. And again, regardless, Elvis, it definitely left a mark for him. And he was already working hard, but after that, I think that was sort of a mental wake-up call that, the anonymity that he came from, it seemed like maybe it was possible he could go back to that. So he basically works his ass off and does the comeback special, which if you've never seen, it's phenomenal. This is the opening song from the special. So the whole show's phenomenal. Probably the most famous part nowadays that's aged the best is the sit-down sessions. Sorry about the glare. But this is Elvis in the ring, and he's in a black leather jacket. It's basically like a proto MTV Unplugged type situation where he's with all of his old friends and buddies and some of the guys from Sun Records he recorded with it in the 50s. And they're all just jamming on songs. And it's just a great like 40 minutes of amazing music. And DJ Fontana, who was his drummer, said later, it felt like we were back home again, which I think, you know, that coming home is sort of a big theme for this record and for Elvis. And I think it's significant that, you know, when he has this big comeback TV show, the show airs, it's a critical success, it's a ratings smash. All of a sudden, practically overnight, it seems Elvis is relevant again. And he's got this, you know, credibility that he can now kind of cash in on. He's got a bit of a blank check to work with now. So I think it's telling that he doesn't say go to London to like record a record or go to California to try something new. He's actually ends up being back in Memphis. His friends basically point out and turn him on to Chips Moman, who is this, who's a record producer in Memphis. He started a label called American Sound Studio in the mid 60s and was basically like a real maverick. It was a real just scruffy operation. It was, you know, they say it was just on the edge of the ghetto in Memphis. It was a brick box of a building in the middle of a five lot strip mall. It originally shared one wall with a barber shop and another with the Ranch House restaurant. There were rats that would run in the rafters that they would sometimes have to cancel a take because they could hear the squeaking. It was really just unsophisticated. The front door, like Sun Records, the front door actually went right into the street, the front door to the recording studio. And they didn't even lock it half the time. When Martin Luther King was assassinated a few miles away, 9 months before Elvis's sessions in Memphis, Chips Moman and his right-hand man, Tommy Cogbill, camped out in the studio for days, armed with guns. Thankfully, no rioters came or anything, but just to give you an idea of how tough the area was and how sort of just what a small operation this was. So Elvis ends up recording with the band now known as the Memphis Boys. And part of why I want to do this record is because so much of Elvis scholarship is focused on Elvis for good reason and for everything he's done. But this album was really a team effort. And it kind of made me realize that Elvis really works best when he's with a great band. And rock and roll itself, you know, you can have a great songwriter like Bob Dylan, but, you know, the stuff he did, his tour with the band, for instance, the Hawks, is really special. And it really takes a band to put a great singer across. And for Elvis's greatest moments at Sun and in 56 and 57 at RCA, and then here in Memphis, he's got these, you know, some of the best bands ever assembled. So this is left to right. We've got Bobby Wood, who is actually one of the two guys in this picture who's still alive. He was originally born in Mississippi and moved to Memphis in his teens. Mike Leach is the next one there. He's the tall one. He played bass. And then Tommy Cogbill is he played bass first and then sort of moved up to become Chips's right-hand man and a producer arranger, as well as filling in on bass when Mike Leach gets sick. The guy all the way in the back there is Gene Chrisman, who you never know it, but is just one of the funkiest drummers that ever lived. And he's the other one who's still live today. I'll just get this mood music going. This is the Memphis Boys a couple of months before Elvis recorded with them. Bobby Emmons has the glasses. He's playing organ, and Reggie Young is the guitarist. Reggie Young actually died the week that I started this book, so unfortunately I wasn't able to reach out to him. So this is obviously Dusty in Memphis, Dusty Springfield, doing Son of a Preacher Man. And this is one of the most famous songs, aside from Elvis's stuff and Sweet Caroline, that the Memphis Boys plays on. Some of the other hits that they did here, we got Son of a Preacher Man, Sandy Posey, Born a Woman, Angel in the Morning, Merrily Rush, Aretha Franklin. The rhythm section and Chips played guitar on Respect. That wasn't at American Sound Records, but it was half of those guys. Neil Diamond, as we're listening to, this was all of them. Actually, they had to postpone the sessions for this song so that they could have Elvis when Elvis wanted to get in there. Box Tops, The Letter, Skinny Legs and All Joe Text, and the original Hooked on a Feeling by B.J. Thomas. These were all top 10 hits around the time that Elvis came into the studio. So Elvis is convinced by his friends, don't go back to RCA. Don't go to their things and just do sort of your normal thing. Like, let's try to shake it up. Like, there's a studio literally, minutes away from your house that's doing some of the best records in the country right now. You got to work with him. You got to give him a shot. So Elvis, he talked into it. And so on January 13th, today, he walks into the American Sound Studio for the first time. He's got this whole entourage, as he always did. Felton Jarvis, who was his producer, seen here. That was his career producer from the mid-'60s to the end of his life. Al Chuki, who was his engineer. George Klein and Marty Lacker, his friends that hooked him up with Chips. Freddie Beanstalk, who was a song plugger for the Hill and Range Song Company. Lamar Fike, who was Elvis's friend and Beanstalk's associate. Tom Dixon represented the Colonel, Elvis's manager, and Harry Jenkins was the vice president of Columbia Records. They all come in, RCA Records, not Columbia. They all walk in together. Elvis's first words are, "What a funky studio," which is kind of a funny thing to say because on one hand, they made very funky music, but on the other hand, they also, looked kind of ramshackle, sort of the old school idea of the word funky. He basically came in and at first he pulled out his little German cigar that he smoked at the time. And about, 10 of his lackeys all tripped over themselves trying to light it. And the Memphis Boys kind of rolled their eyes being like, is this just going to be like a big cartoon character that we're working with? But then, Elvis wanted to put on a good face as the Memphis Boys did too. And he took about an hour, he's shaking hands with everybody there, meeting them, getting all ready to go. And then they start recording. And the first song that Elvis sings is Long Black Limousine, which we'll get to in a sec, but it's actually the third song he recorded that first night that became the opening cut on the record that is the sort of the great opening statement for this whole project. All right, so this is a new song by Dallas Frazier and Arthur L. Owens, Wearing That Loved On Look. It's a really fascinating choice for Elvis because the song lyrically ostensibly is about somebody whose woman has been untrue while he's been away. But when Elvis sings it, there's sort of the two things going on at once. There's the singer in the song that's coming home to find that, his lover's been untrue, presumably, and partying and whatnot. But then there's also the idea of Elvis sort of coming back home to Memphis, to rock and roll after being away for so long. And the idea that then he's sort of like, what's happened to you type thing. And, in the song, there are references to Bonnie and Clyde. There are references to, long-haired people at sort of all-night parties and sort of this idea of this almost counterculture, almost hippie element, and that he's sort of, suspicious of in a way. So it really becomes a song not just about coming home to a person, but then also coming home to the music. So it's really kind of a remarkable song for him to essentially begin with. And, it's no coincidence that it's the beginning of the record. And Elvis has a bit of a head cold this first night. So his voice sounds even better in a way because it's a little bit, he's fighting it a little bit because it's a little bit hoarse. So it adds that much power to it. So I'm going to go through, just highlight some of the songs here from the album. I don't have time to do them all. I may not even have time to do all these, but we'll see what we can do. The second song on the album is probably the most famous song after the single In the Ghetto. This is Only the Strong Survive. It was the only song on the record written by African-American songwriters. It was originally done by Jerry Butler, who co-wrote the song with Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff. It was inspired by some words of wisdom that Jerry Butler's mother gave him about, being like not letting the first girl that breaks your heart, stop you, and that keep going on and whatnot. And for Elvis, his connection to his mother was paramount. His mother died when he was entering the army in the summer of 1958, and they had just a very close, almost sickly relationship. I mean, there were periods, I think, where they shared a bed when Vernon was away and in jail, actually. And she walked him to school till he was 15. It said if he got out of her sight when he was a kid, he'd get in huge trouble for that. They were just very, very close. And in Priscilla, his wife's autobiography, she would even say, I was to learn that Elvis's mother, Gladys, was the love of his life. Elvis really just idolized her, and she was such a strong figure throughout his while she was alive. So for this to be a song about relying on your mother's advice really sort of has like this extra meaning for Elvis, as somebody that really did listen to his mother for all sorts of advice and how to best live his life. And, it said that she believed in him before anyone else. And one would think that one of the reasons why he was able to finally get the nerve to go into Sun Records and do the performances and records he made was because of her confidence in him. He was always her biggest star in her eyes, I think. And he never forgot that. He said when she died, he told her when she died, both he and his dad, Vernon, were completely distraught. He cried during the funeral and threw himself on the casket and said, don't take her, take me. It was pretty intense. He said to a reporter at that time, it wasn't only like losing a mother, it was like losing a friend, a companion, someone to talk to. If I was worried or troubled about something, well, she'd get up and try to help me. So for Elvis to be singing this song sort of brings things back to the familial side of home. And for Elvis, that meant his mother, which means everything. The next song that comes on the record is sort of a jam session that called I'll Hold You in My Heart Till I Can Hold You in My Arms. And it speaks to just the sort of offhandedness of the sessions. This was a song that most evoked the sit-down shows at during the Comeback special that are so magical and really let Elvis sort of show off what he could do the best. So he basically was just sort of playing around on the piano after they cut some songs really late at night, and everybody sort of jumps in with him. And there's only one take of this, and it was released. This is the take. So he's on piano. The Memphis Boys sort of slowly fall in. So Elvis is just singing. It goes on for about 4 minutes, and he just keeps going back around to the bridge over and over again, trying to sort of find himself in it. And it's pretty amazing because although it's best known as a country song, Eddie Arnold had a #1 hit for 22 weeks on the country charts, 19 in the 40s. And then Eddie Fisher, Tony Martin, Dean Martin, all these different pop singers did it. And Elvis, his version is closest to the Dean Martin one, except Elvis really slows it down. And it's funny because you can hear him sort of turn it into this sort of groovy blues thing, even though it's a country song. And in his head, he's got Dean Martin. So it really just speaks to Elvis's just uncanny ability to just amalgamate all these different strands of American music, just off the cuff, completely, just naturally, in a way that if we're going to say that he brilliance or genius, that's what it would be. This is now my favorite song on the album. This is Long Black Limousine. This is, for me, one of Elvis's best performances, one of his best songs ever. The fact that he walked in and just did it cold this was the first song they recorded. There's about 15 minutes of tape of him doing it, and then they moved on, and it's phenomenal. So I'm just going to let it play for a little bit. All right, so there's a lot to this song, and I'm not doing it justice by stopping it midway through, but it was originally a country song and a country standard. Oddly, it never was much of a hit. The only person to ever chart to this date with a version of the song was Jody Miller, who it hit number 73 on the country charts. But all the sort of early versions of the song are very much like a sentimental parlor music country waltz. Essentially, spoiler alert, it's about a girl that goes to the city that this kid, this sort of nameless kid from a small town, has fallen in love with. And she says, one day I'll come back in a long black limousine. And she keeps her promise and she comes back. But then you find out in the bridge and then the final verse that it's actually sort of there's a twist. She has died after she became a big star in Hollywood. And the car that was bringing her back home, the long black limousine, is actually a hearse. And the kid that was in love with her is watching the funeral procession go by. And he declares that he'll never love another, which is just basically it's a very powerful situation. You throw on the idea too that this is like a faceless random person, and that let me just say first, actually, that the version that Elvis bases his on is O.C. Smith, who had a big hit with Little Green Apples, and this was actually the B-side. So Elvis's version is not like the country versions. They're kind of like this rhythm and blues version. And then the fact he's singing to a star that's gone away and now is coming back dead, it's a powerful idea. And whereas the other song, the country songs almost make it into like a little bit of like not exactly a joke, but just sort of sentimental parlor music, Elvis really takes it seriously, and death really saturates the song. And for him, it's this duality of this girl going away and becoming famous and dying, and then him coming back and declaring that he'll never love anyone else. And everything else is sort of irrelevant at that point. And we as the listener, it's like Elvis singing to us. And so then it becomes like we're the girl in the limousine on one level. because the whole song is sung in the second person. But of course, in real life, Elvis is the one that went off, became famous, and died. So the whole thing, it just has lots of layers, and it's just a beautiful performance. And it stands on par with anything that Elvis did before, after, or since. So then in the book, I then sort of take a break between side one and side two, and talk about a little bit about this song called "Stranger in My Own Hometown." Elvis went on a ski trip with Priscilla after the first couple of weeks recording in January. He set up a couple more in February, and the first night that he comes back, one of the first things they do is this song. He's much more confident and sort of has everything in the pocket, as they say. And this is a song that he always liked, called "Stranger in My Own Hometown." Again, there's only one take of this. I'm sorry, there's only one take of this. Here we go. Let's listen. So it's pretty remarkable that Elvis is so into the song called "Stranger in My Own Hometown." It came out in 1964, the year that the Beatles started out selling Elvis and everybody. And I've always wondered if maybe he felt sort of a kindred spirit to Percy Mayfield, who wrote and originally recorded the song. It wasn't a hit for Percy Mayfield, but Elvis clearly heard it and remembered it. And it's sort of beautiful in a way that he is recording it here at this juncture, right in the middle of these sessions, like literally the very middle. He decides to sing this song about being a stranger in your own hometown, which picks up on all the themes of From Elvis in Memphis. Unfortunately, they didn't end up including it in From Elvis in Memphis, probably because they thought it was too it wasn't polished enough. But that's kind of what makes it great. It went on the second album of studio material from this record, that was first released on the From Memphis to Vegas, From Vegas to Memphis double set in 1969, and then later back in Memphis. And Chips only ever wanted to do one album of all good stuff. He didn't want all sort of second level stuff to be released. Of course, RCA went ahead and still released the secondary stuff, but fortunately that got "Stranger in My Own Hometown" out there, because this is one of the few songs that's not on the record that rivals almost everything else that made it on the album. The most famous song on the album is the closer, "In the Ghetto." Like "Long Black Limousine," it really struck, and "Only the Strong Survive," it struck a lot of different chords for Elvis. Again, there's a lot going on here. It's about a young African-American person in the Chicago ghetto that is, born into poverty and basically grows up and, robs a store and steals a gun and steals a car and then gets shot down in the street while his mother cries. And then the song famously ends with another baby being born as his mother cries, and the idea that it just sort of keeps going on forever. I'm not going to play too much of this because I think most people know this song. Elvis originally didn't want to do this song because it was seen as a message song, and the Colonel really didn't like him doing stuff like that. He felt like it was going to splinter the audience that he spent all these years building. But they finally got through to Elvis, or depending on who you speak to, Elvis changed his mind, or someone said, you should do it, because he got word that someone else was going to record the song if he didn't. And then, so he wanted to crack at it. He could tell it was a great song. And he sings it, very seriously. Some people might find it a little too sentimental today, a little cheesy, but he still sings it with conviction, and it was a major hit. It didn't hit #1 on Billboard, but it hit #1 pretty much everywhere else, Record World and Cashbox. and hit number 3. It was Elvis's biggest hit in the US since 1965. And it was the first music that anyone heard from American Sound Studio that Elvis had recorded, this new music after the Comeback special. So the next part of my book then is about the back cover of the record, which is telling more for what it doesn't have than what it has. This is, it doesn't give any album credits. It doesn't talk about any of the musicians. It doesn't talk about Chips. It doesn't have the words American Sound, any of the backup singers, any of the guys playing horns, any of the guys playing strings. And in fact, that picture of Elvis is actually from a photo shoot from Viva Las Vegas in 1963. So it's not even a modern picture of Elvis. And, you know, about a quarter of it is taken up for an ad for the previous album for the Comeback special soundtrack. So this is kind of a missed opportunity, and also just sort of just showing how Elvis could get packaged even over the, you know, the way that Chips and the Memphis Boys would have wanted to have the music presented. And of course, Elvis then goes back to goes back to Las Vegas after recording this record, does his first live shows in about 8 years, and has sort of this big renaissance as a live performer. And he ends up, one of the songs he releases at the peak of all that is Suspicious Minds. So nowadays, this is one of his very most famous songs. This is now, Rolling Stone earlier this year did a list of the 500 greatest songs of all time. This is Elvis's only entry in the top 100. I think it's number 70, Suspicious Minds. And it is, it's just a great song. It's an amazing performance. You know, lots of people still know it to this day. It was a #1 hit in Billboard, the last #1 Billboard hit of his lifetime. And it's just one of his iconic songs. And again, although it wasn't included on From Elvis in Memphis, it was the one of the singles. It was the next single released after it, and came from the exact same sessions right before they took the break in the middle at the end of January. And it's really just a testament to the versatility of the Memphis Boys and Elvis's talent. So Elvis never set foot in American Sound Studio again after leaving in February, and then I think doing some overdubs maybe a month or two later. But there are all these theories about why. I personally think that it was a mutual need to control between the egos of Elvis, Chips, and the Colonel. I personally wonder if, since Elvis had defied the Colonel by doing the Comeback special, and then defied the Colonel by not going to RCA but going to American Sound with Chips to record a record, you know, the Colonel's quoted as saying, "Oh, let him fall on his ass, you know, whatever, he'll see that he's making a big mistake." He comes out with this amazing, critically acclaimed music. I personally wonder if the Colonel didn't maybe set up the Vegas shows as a way to kind of reassert the power in terms of, you know, you're going to sing on these days at these times in this hotel, make this much money, and you're welcome. And so when Elvis first stepped into the American Sound Studio in '69, he was both a prodigal son coming home and a stranger in his own hometown. By the time he left a few months later, his status as a rock and roll legend and artist was assured. He was no longer had to worry about longing to become someone. He had found himself by coming back home. This is the historical marker that now stands in the place of American Sound Records. American Sound Studio was demolished in 1989. It's now a family dollar store. And this plaque is the only thing standing in its place that'll tell you about it. And all members of the Memphis Boys and Chips Moman have not been inducted in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, even though they now have the sidemen and non-performer categories. Not one of them has been inducted, which is crazy. I think in large part because American Sound Studio was never a label effectively, unlike Motown or Sun or Stax, where the in-house bands were also playing on these on their own label. So anyway, that's sort of my advocacy for them. And yeah, thank you for everybody listening. And I had a lot of fun, and I'm happy to take lots of questions. So thank you.
Thanks, Eric. That was excellent. Thank you so much for doing this. We have a lot of comments going on here in the chat, and a lot of questions going on too.
All right.
So we could go through some of these here. There was one asked early on that I kind of put a little note next to because it was specific to a certain time you were talking about Old MacDonald had a farm, and somebody asked the question of why did he not drop Colonel Parker at this point?
Colonel Parker, if his mother believed in him before anyone else did, Colonel Parker then like proved that Elvis could be successful before anybody else did. And the Colonel, he's clearly like a very charismatic but also manipulative person. The legend is he said to Elvis, "You've got $1 million voice. Now let's give you $1 million." And he basically took this, Southern country singer, and just launched him in this way, like this huge breakthrough that no one saw coming. And I think just after the impact of all that, Elvis was a very loyal person. And they always kept making money. I don't think any Elvis film ever lost money. And I think Elvis was just enough of sort of going through the motions that all the stuff that the Colonel told him to do in the 50s got him to where he was. And then the industry was just sort of changing without him. And, lo and behold, this expat guy from, from the Netherlands that's, might be a murderer. If you want to look it up, it's pretty cool. Smithsonian.com has an amazing article about him possibly being a murderer on the lam. Anyway, but he he felt loyal to the Colonel. And then whenever he tried to do anything getting out of a movie or something, the Colonel would always say, "Well, I hear you, but we signed the contracts. There are all these cameramen, there are all these extras, there are all these actors, they're all expecting their pay from this. And, we've already set it up." And so Elvis was sort of, like, okay, I don't want to be the bad guy. And so he would just keep going back and do that. And unfortunately, Old MacDonald for me is sort of the lowest of the low points of when he, was talked into doing something they didn't want to do. And the Colonel outlived Elvis. He lived into the 90s, and they asked him after Elvis died, "What are you going to do?" And he goes, "Well, I'm going to just keep doing my job." He goes, "It's just like Elvis was in the army.
Yeah.
I'm just going to keep promoting him." And he made tons of money. He had a 50-50 split with Elvis, which was unusual. So he was making like half the money, which is crazy. But
that is pretty crazy. How about a music related comment / question? Gary Anderson comments on one of the pictures that Elvis is playing a bass in the picture. And I know he did do that sometimes in the 50s too. Do you want to say anything about that, or?
Yeah, that's Tommy Coghill's bass. He he's the sort of second in command under Chips, who was the original bass player. And then sort of when Mike Leach came in, Leach took over and Cogbill did more arranging. But that's definitely Cogbill's bass that Elvis found in the studio and just sort of playing around with it. I think it's interesting. Some of the interviews that I quoted, the Memphis newspaper did an interview with Elvis in 1965 in Graceland, and he's actually fiddling around with the bass in those pictures too, like on his couch. And when the Beatles came to visit him at Graceland, it said that Elvis took the bass off the wall, and that Paul McCartney made some sort of comment to, about playing the bass that then sort of opened it up, that they had their, famously non-recorded jam that they all had. Yeah. But again, it was Elvis playing the bass. So I've always wondered if Elvis just was interested in the bass. I don't know. There's nothing written that I've seen about that, but there are these 3 points where he's just fiddling, like he's in a place that's filled with instruments and he goes for the bass, the electric bass, unplugged. So
that's well. Let's keep Eric Martin Patrick asked the question. I was wondering if you could speak a bit towards how Elvis chose his material during the late 60s period. Look forward to reading your book. Thank you.
Awesome. Look forward to having you read it. And this was different, was one of the big things that I didn't have time to get into here. There are just so many pieces to this, is that Chips basically was like, Chips essentially had veto power over what Elvis recorded. And normally their stuff was limited to the Hill and Range. Elvis wasn't apparently aware of this until midway through recording this album. And basically it's that he got kickbacks along with the Colonel from Hill and Range, which was a publishing company in the 50s and the 60s, And so all the songs that they got were from there. It's been making the press a lot lately, with Dolly Parton, about how she originally wrote um, uh, "I Will Always Love You." Right? That's what is that the
Yeah.
Yeah, and that then Elvis, wanted to do it, but then she'd have to give up half of her publishing, and she's like, "Well, I had a family to feed. I wasn't about to do that." And so they basically couldn't come to a deal, But imagine if Elvis had sung that. But the point is that they, in the 50s, there was enough clout to be like, well, yeah, you've give away half your publishing, but Elvis is going to do your song. So in 1956, that meant something, but by 1966, that meant less of a thing, especially with Bob Dylan and the Beatles writing their own songs and essentially becoming like, songwriting publishing houses, groups sort of self-contained within in them of themselves. And Elvis was never interested in songwriting. He is credited with a couple songs under his name, but some of them are just to get publishing royalties. I think there's only one or two songs that he actually really sat down and co-wrote. And that just was never his interest. He was more of an interpreter. So a lot of these songs normally would have come from the Hill and Range people, but Chips was reaching out to younger songwriters like Mac Davis, who wrote in the Ghetto, and Bill James, who wrote Mark James, sorry, not Bill James, Mark James, that wrote Suspicious Minds, and these sort of lesser known younger songwriters that were writing really good stuff. And, Elvis was like, if we can get the publishing, great. If we can't, I still want to do it. And again, this sort of newfound spirit and confidence in these Memphis sessions that then by the early to mid 70s, he's sort of back to just doing whatever demos are given to him.
Yeah.
The only Hill and Range demo that he ended up doing was the first song on the second side, Power of My Love. Everything else was done by somebody in sort of a different network, which again was very unusual.
There's actually a pretty good song on that album too. He kind of really kicks butt on that.
It does. It's
vocally, yeah.
The Searcher. They, if you've seen that documentary, that's when it like goes to black for the credits, and I'm like, wow, the whole catalog. That,
Yeah. There's, speaking of the later 70s and all the songwriting stuff, there's a question here that I think fits from Gary Anderson. He says, your book is excellent. On Twitter the other day, you said For Old Time's Sake is one of the weaker albums, and I agree. But what other late 70s Elvis albums do you think are worth a deeper dive? I think there's a lot of people who'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that here.
Oh yeah, and I want to say too that I love all periods of Elvis. I even love Old MacDonald, like in a weird way. But in terms of the later period Elvis, I think his last four albums are all very interesting in different ways. Kind of like how the Beatles' first four albums are all very interesting, the UK versions.
Yeah.
I think I'd say though, Promised Land is really the best. I think that's his last, just pretty much wall-to-wall classic. The title song is phenomenal. And I personally think that's kind of the last great, like maybe I'd say on my website, I rank the entire discography, and I think that I gave that one 4 stars out of 5. And I think it's just a solid 4-star album, where after that he was doing more like, I'd say 2 to 3 star albums. So Promised Land is the one that I'd go for the later period. The Jungle Sessions set that they came out with a few years ago, where they took off a lot of the overdubs and used different takes, that's got a lot of really interesting stuff in it and gives you a new perspective on the late period too. So I recommend that as well. It's just sort of like an overview. But in terms of just like an LP, I'd say Promised Land.
Great. Even further going here, Clay has a question. He was talking about I believe the new like orchestrated, I forget what orchestra does the overdubs on some of those songs, but
London Symphony.
Yeah. And he's wondering how do you feel about the original versions of the American studio songs or the more recent versions that have been released with overdubs and orchestration?
I was so focused on putting together the story of this record that I really just buried myself into the originals. I actively avoided any of those newer overdubs. I've heard some of them, not the American Sound ones, but some of them just on Elvis radio now and then. And they always sort of make me cringe a little bit. I'm as sort of a historian, I always want like the original version. So I honestly haven't heard it. And most of what I was listening to were the sets that FTD put out of the takes and whatnot. So I was listening to a lot of this without even the string overdubs that you hear on the record, just to kind of get that. And it's amazing how full the sound is even without strings and backup singers.
Do you want to keep going for a few more questions here? You
Absolutely
feeling good?
Yeah, I'm good as long as you guys. I don't mean to keep you guys.
No,
I'm good to go. I'll talk Elvis all night, man.
I'm trying to like combine some of them too here. We've got a question here was, why does he return to recording in Nashville after the commercial and critical success of this album? And then somebody else later asks about, he does record at Stack, so he does do a little more in Memphis. So I don't know if you want to combine those two or just.
Sure. Yeah, it's the thing is, it was a commercial success, but it wasn't a huge. It hit 13 on the Billboard charts, whereas for comparison, the Comeback Special soundtrack hit 8. So that was like a much better selling album, bigger hit. It really didn't. It sold pretty well, but it wasn't like a smash. Like the Aloha from Hawaii concert was the last #1 Billboard album in his lifetime in 1973. That was like a very well-selling record. Whereas I think of this one as more akin to Pet Sounds, where like it did fine. It actually did hit #1 in 1 week for 1 week in the UK, but stateside, it's sort of, there was so much. I mean, this is 1969. It's coming out the same year as Abbey Road and Let It Bleed, and freaking all these just Hallmark albums. So it wasn't such a huge success in its day. And a lot of people were really drawn to Elvis's first Vegas shows, because that was his first live shows in about 8 years. So Rolling Stone and all that, when they put him on the cover, they're, talking about sort of that, getting ready to do Vegas. And, all the critics just lost their minds when they went and saw him do the shows. And then in terms of Stax, Stax is sort of, I have to be careful what I say, because when he went to American Sound, it was really like it was a good combination of these different artistic visions coming together and sort of traditions meeting up. But with Stax, it really seems to be that he was just a lot lazier and just, it was the closest studio nearby. By 1973, American Sound wasn't even around anymore. It closed down in 72. Even though some of the guys, I think, played on the Stax sessions. So when he went to Stax, it wasn't so much this big homecoming thing. It was more just like they were having trouble getting him motivated. So it was just, well, we'll just drive 10 minutes from your house and go to Stax, which, his first sessions, and those are the ones that did the For Old Time's Sake record and Raised on Rock, which is just not my favorite. But then he did some sessions in December that are really, really amazing and special. And the Good Times record came out of that, which is also quite good. And again, I think that was a bit more of a fluke, because they say that when he got to Stax, sort of they didn't know how to read each other. Whereas for whatever reason, the Memphis Boys and Elvis were really able to kind of gauge each other and read the room for each other better. Whereas the Stax, he had already sort of become this Vegas like superhero icon. Yeah. So I think it was harder to sort of break through that wall with him. And I think they were sort of standoffish, and the music they're playing is sort of more of a funk rhythm, whereas I think the Memphis Boys are a little bit more versatile in certain ways. Yeah. So I don't know if that, and I think it also was easier to go to Nashville just because that's where all the songwriting was set up and everything. And, obviously those 1970 and 71 sessions he did at Nashville were actually quite good, and were the basis of most of the rest of the career. But again, it's too bad that he didn't, I don't know why he didn't return to American Sound, but sort of like Sun Records, there's sort of just this one short period of amazing stuff where it's all phenomenal.
Yeah.
Kind of like its own reward.
Yeah. I'm still trying to combine some here for you that I think would work. There's a question. First question would be, who decided Felton Jarvis should be in charge of Elvis's RCA input? And then there's another question, was Chips Moman also the producer on the non-Elvis hits prior from Elvis in Memphis? So I think that's kind of, I think like Felton and Chips kind of, their stories are kind of interesting. So I'm sure you could add to that for sure.
Definitely. Yeah. Jarvis Felton was actually he's I think a year or two younger than Elvis, and he was like a rockabilly singer who loved Elvis and tried to become a singer like Elvis. Ended up kind of working in the industry instead, but he had seen Elvis live in '55 and was like a huge fan. So by the mid '60s, I think 1966, he essentially gets assigned to Elvis as sort of to be Elvis's producer, and he just loves and idolizes Elvis. So he, some people would say that he maybe sort of led to Elvis's decline a little bit. He still did it. Again, it's like you don't want to put your foot in your mouth, but sorry, I'm trying to find this quote. So Chips so when he came into American Sound, since Felton was sort of assigned to Elvis, he was there as a producer, but really he was kind of only the producer in name because it was really Chips's show. And it said that I've gotten in trouble online saying stuff to this, so I'll try to be careful, but that I sort of get the impression that Felton was sort of in charge of watching Elvis and Chips was in charge of watching everything else, and that Chips was really sort of doing all the stuff and Felton was he was a producer who was doing stuff, but it was, Chips's home base. And Felton was just want to make sure that Elvis was comfortable and sort of appeasing him. And there's a quote that I, of course, now can't find. That is, okay. So this is Reggie Young, who played guitar. He said after the sessions, Chips had more, what would it be, constructive criticism. He'd say, "You were a little flat there." I don't believe Felton had ever said that. And then Wayne Carson, who was one of the new songwriters at American Sound, said, put this more bluntly and said that if Elvis missed his mark, quote, Chip stood up and said, "Hey, this ain't no fucking movie soundtrack. You need to sing that song." And I've listened to all the outtakes. I haven't been able to find that. So I think it's a bit of an exaggeration, but the point is that Chips is willing to be like, no one had stopped Elvis in, 10 years and was like, "Dude, that was flat. Yeah. Start again." Like Elvis essentially was his own producer. Yeah. But, and Felton Jarvis, he then, went back to Elvis and still continued for the remainder of his career. But to have someone to challenge him like Chips did, and then like Sam Phillips did in the '50s, it really led to some of his most rewarding work, I think.
Yeah. Somebody asked a question that I think we were talking about the EPE and what you could do for them, which I think would be a lot. But somebody asked, will you guys be at the 45th Elvis Week in Memphis this August? I think this would be a great event for it, and we hope you are already in contact with the planners.
I'd love that. If anyone knows, I've tried to, ask not what EPE can do for you. I tried reaching out to just like the Graceland site and all that, just to let them know. David Brown did an article in Rolling Stone about how they're having trouble because my generation and younger they're just not into Elvis. They don't know him as well. And they're looking for ways to kind of connect with the younger people. And that was part of why I wanted to do a 33 1/3, especially about Elvis, is that at the time, the only artist who was active in the 1950s that had a book out when I wrote this, rock artist, was James Brown. Now there's a Sam Cooke volume, and there's going to be a Little Richard coming out, which I'm totally pumped for. But I really wanted there's so much where people's idea of rock history starts with the Beatles. And there's really sort of this crucial Elvis, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Jerry Lee Lewis, Buddy Holly thing that I feel like gets overlooked. And there's just so much good music in such a short amount of time. But yeah, I'd love to do an event. If anyone knows anybody.
How you get down there. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll get down there. That sounds awesome. Yeah. I love that idea.
Yeah. There was a question going back to the 70s stuff that I can't find it now, but I remember the gist of it. It was asking about why did he stop doing photo sessions for his albums? Most of the covers were just live performance shots.
It's interesting. So this got to be like a little thing on one of my tweets this week, actually. Someone said that they thought that it's because he just didn't like how he looked at that point as much. Yeah. And he that his eyes would often be puffy from various staying up too late or doing whatever substances.
Yeah.
So, I don't really know. I think it's just he didn't have to do them. I think he didn't like it, and probably felt pretty fake. And he did so much live performance that they could just do that. Unfortunately, it makes his whole '70s catalog look like just one big
Right.
guy behind a black background. That Grill Marcus, I think, said that all the albums blur in that time, so that it just becomes this product called Elvis.
Yeah.
I don't. That's a good question. But by the time he does the American Sound stuff, he doesn't. He's not doing new photo shoots anymore of any kind. And the only singles that didn't have that black cover were the Steamroller Blues, as someone pointed out on Twitter, which has a picture of a steamroller, and then the I've Got You is just the words I've got you, or I've lost you, sorry. And the Christmas single has just a little picture of him as Santa. And that's it. I meant to tweet that out and I didn't. So, but yeah.
There's a comment in here, and I always find these are interesting because I was born after he died, and I've always been a fan of his. But somebody says I saw Elvis twice in Las Vegas in the '70s, and I always think that's really cool when people talk about that. And they say great memories. Thanks for the presentation, Yvonne.
Yay! Thank you. I met somebody who one of the guys that I did a podcast with met Elvis, and it's so funny because it was just like Elvis was watching a football game, I guess, that his friends were playing, and he went over and Elvis just said hey and signed him something without even looking at him. And he was like, oh, okay, that was Elvis. And then Elvis in some ways is much bigger now than he was when he was alive.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you have a favorite Elvis live album?
Live album. If we can count the King in the Ring, these are just a double record. He did 2 shows of the sit down concerts.
Yeah.
And if we count those as live shows, which they were, this is just magic. This is among his best music. And then in terms of his actual more traditional live albums, I'd probably say On Stage from 1970. That's the one with Polk Salad Annie and The Wonder of You. And it's really just the apex of his Vegas stuff before it becomes sort of phoned in and cheesier.
Yeah, that's those are great. I always like the first Vegas stint, the '69 stuff before it got to he didn't have the intro song down right, and the band was still kind of it was almost like '68 Comeback special music, but
yes,
with the TCB, or what became the TCB band, it was kind of
no, you're absolutely right. The version of Suspicious Minds is that's on that from Memphis to Vegas, Vegas to Memphis double set. That's phenomenal. The ended version, and that's what they're trying to capture. Then that's one of the other things that Chips got really pissed about, is that they then went to the Suspicious Minds single and did the extension and did the fade in and fade out to try to match how he did it live. And Chips was like, "What is?" They just laughed at it. They were like, "This is pathetic."
There's a question about the new Colonel Parker biopic coming out with Tom Hanks in it. Do you have any thoughts about that? Or
I think that's an odd casting choice.
Yeah.
But, I'm still going to see it. I'm very curious. I really like Tom Hanks. I just think that that just seems like that just seems like stunt casting to me a little bit.
Yeah.
I'll be curious if you can get the voice, because he had this faint accent from being Dutch. So I'll be interested to see if he's able to capture that. That's actually, I'm more curious about how he'll sound than how he'll look.
Right. I'm interested about it too. I feel like a lot of these Elvis movies, they always fall short, because I think he's almost impossible he's so the person is so hard to just copy. Agreed. But I do like Tom Hanks when he does things and he nods back to previous eras, and I think he does a good job of that. So I'm kind of
He does. No, that's a good point. Yeah.
Excited to see what he does with that. Man, I'm still scrolling through some questions here.
Yeah, it looks like there's over 99 questions.
Yeah. A lot of them are comments, and a lot of people are talking about the times they saw Elvis in the '70s, which is really kind of cool to see here.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Oh, this makes me so happy. I wish I could have seen Elvis. Too late.
Did we get everything here? There's a question that's always kind of one that I feel like always pops up with Elvis stuff is, can you talk about Elvis and his drug use at all?
Sure. I've read and heard interviews from both sides. The defense that I've always heard is that Elvis never took drugs recreationally. That Elvis, there was a reason for every drug he was prescribed, and that, I think it was Larry Geller, his spiritual advisor and hairdresser. I heard an interview with him when I was a kid on it was then only Boston based, Jay Gordon's Elvis in the Morning Sunday morning radio show, out of Oldies 103 in Boston. And he talks about, he was explaining like, oh, everyone says Elvis was just doing drugs left, right, and center, but what you got to realize is he had to keep his weight down, so he was on diet pills. The lights really hurt his eyes. He had to like cover his eyes for hours after every show, so he took medicine for that. And he had whatever stuff. There was always a reason for it. And I think at the same time that can be true, and it can also be that he was abusing and being addictive. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think it's obviously a tragedy, but I also think he, I think he and his inner circle were able to rationalize it to an extent. It's clear that it was out of hand and that he was not healthy by the end. And I mean, I don't know really if he was doing speed. They first gave him speed in the Army because he had to do all those all night shifts. And so I think that was the first time he did anything, because he wasn't into obviously psychedelics or whatnot. I don't know of him ever taking acid. That would be really cool to know though. I doubt it, but I don't know. He was definitely more of like, well, I mean, he was pretty clean actually, because he didn't smoke. He didn't he smoked those little cigars, but not really cigarettes. So.
All right, Eric, I think we've pretty much covered everything. And if there's anything else you'd like to add in, I do want to remind everybody that we have a discount code for the book. There's an email address in the chat, mwhite@glenviewpubliclibrary.org. But if you don't have access to a pen or anything right now, just reach out to the Northbrook Library, the Glenview Library, or the Arlington Heights Library, and somebody will put you in contact with Neil, Michael, or myself, and we can help you with that. Eric, anything else you want to add?
I put up a website when I came out with this book that's from elvisandmemphis.com, and it's basically all the stuff I wanted to put into appendices that there wasn't room for. So I have session, song by song, session information, who wrote it, who's playing on it, everything I could think of, all the release date history of this album, because it's been reissued dozens of times, and also essays that have stuff like my reviews of his entire discography while he was alive, and just various articles about him that I've written or put up there. So I recommend doing that. And I would just like to say that, he only recorded 32 songs in American Sound Records Studios. And of those, 12.5% were top 20 hits, which is kind of crazy.
Wow.
And was really his most productive sessions up to that point in his life. And, I think it says a lot that I personally think they stand with the Sun stuff and the early RCA as his best work.
Sure. Yeah.
But I just also want to say thank you to Bill and everybody, and Michael and everyone at the library for having me. I want to thank all the people that were listening. I want to thank all the people that were been leaving their Elvis live stories. I'm super jealous. And this was a real passion project. And I'm at from Elvis in 333 on Twitter. And I do This Day in Elvis History every day. So check it out. It's a good time.
All right. Thank you so much again, Eric.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody. Thank you for attending tonight's program.